The farmer watches the sky at 0600 hours on August 2nd, 1944. Mihailovic Jovanovic stands in a field near Pranjani, Serbia, listening to aircraft engines growing louder. Around him, 300 Serbian villagers have spent the night clearing an improvised airstrip, cutting down corn stalks, smoothing the dirt runway, all in darkness to avoid detection by German patrols 4 miles away. In the tree line, 512 American airmen wait, shot down over occupied Yugoslavia during bombing missions to Ploiești oil fields, hidden for weeks or months by Serbian villagers who risked execution to shelter them. In 10 minutes, the first C-47 transport will land on this field that did not exist yesterday. In 6 hours, over 200 airmen will be evacuated in the largest rescue of downed aircrew behind enemy lines in military history. And over the next 4 months, Operation Halyard will extract 512 Americans from Yugoslavia without losing a single evader or rescuer, an achievement made possible by Serbian civilians who fed, clothed, and protected strangers while facing German occupation, communist insurgency, and the knowledge that discovery meant death for entire villages. Yugoslavia in 1944 was chaos compressed into geography. The country had been invaded by Germany in April 1941, conquered in 11 days, and dismembered. Serbia came under direct German military occupation. Croatia became a puppet state under the fascist Ustaše regime. Slovenia was divided between Germany and Italy. Bosnia became a battleground where Axis forces, communist partisans, Serbian royalists, and Croatian fascists fought each other with a brutality that made conventional warfare seem civilized. 3 main resistance movements operated in occupied Yugoslavia. The communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito, supplied by the Soviet Union and later by Britain, controlled large areas of Bosnia, Montenegro, and Croatia. The Serbian Chetniks under General Dragoljub Draža Mihailovic, loyal to the Yugoslav government in exile in London, controlled parts of Serbia and opposed both the Germans and the communists. The Croatian Ustaše, nominally allied with Germany, pursued genocidal campaigns against Serbs, Jews, and Roma while fighting partisans and Chetniks. Into this nightmare fell American airmen. The strategic bombing campaign against Axis oil production targeted the Ploiești refineries in Romania, which supplied over 30% of German petroleum needs. The route from American air bases in Italy to Ploiești crossed Yugoslavia, over territory held by Germans, partisans, Chetniks, and various factions whose allegiances shifted with opportunity. Aircraft damaged by flak or fighters over Romania often could not make it back to Italy. Crews bailed out over Yugoslavia, descended by parachute into occupied territory, and faced immediate choices: evade toward partisan lines, toward Chetnik territory, or attempt to hide among civilians. The first American airmen began arriving in Serbian territory in spring 1944. Local villagers, despite German occupation and the omnipresent threat of reprisal, took them in. The Serbian tradition of hospitality, particularly toward those in distress, operated even under conditions where harboring Allied airmen meant automatic death for the family involved and often destruction of the entire village. General Mihailovic, the Chetnik leader, made protection of Allied airmen official policy. His forces, scattered across Serbian territory, received orders to locate downed airmen, protect them, and prepare for eventual evacuation. This was partly humanitarian and partly political. Mihailovic needed Allied support. The British had abandoned him in favor of Tito's partisans. The Americans were his last hope for recognition and supply. Protecting their airmen was investment in future Allied favor. By July 1944, over 300 American airmen were scattered across Chetnik-held territory in Serbia. They lived in villages, slept in barns and peasant houses, ate food that villagers could barely spare, and waited. No organized rescue effort existed. The Office of Strategic Services had agents in Yugoslavia, but they operated with Tito's partisans, not with Mihailovic's Chetniks. The split reflected Allied policy. Britain and America officially supported Tito, viewing him as more effective against the Germans. Mihailovic, despite his loyalty to the government in exile, was considered militarily ineffective and politically suspect. But the airmen were in Chetnik territory, not partisan territory. Rescuing them required working with Mihailovic, whether Allied command liked it or not. Lieutenant George Mussolini, an OSS officer of Serbian descent who spoke the language fluently, advocated for a rescue mission. He had parachuted into Yugoslavia in 1943, worked with both partisans and Chetniks, and understood the political complexities. In July 1944, he proposed a plan: infiltrate a team into Chetnik territory, organize the scattered airmen into groups, construct an improvised airstrip, and evacuate them by C-47 transports flying from Italy. The plan violated official policy. Allied command supported Tito, not Mihailovich. Working with the Chetniks, even to rescue American airmen, risked offending Tito and undermining the political strategy of backing communist resistance. But over 300 Americans were stranded behind enemy lines. The policy objections seemed abstract compared to the concrete reality of men waiting for rescue. Permission was granted quietly, unofficially, with the understanding that if the operation failed or created political problems, it would be disavowed. Mussolini assembled a team, himself, 2 other OSS officers, and several radio operators. On August 2nd, they parachuted into Serbia near Pranjani, a village 30 miles south of the German garrison at Čačak. Mihailovich's forces controlled the area tenuously. Germans patrolled regularly. The situation could change within hours. The reception committee included Mihailovich himself and over 500 Serbian civilians who had gathered to witness the arrival. The scene was surreal. An American officer parachuting into occupied territory to coordinate with a resistance movement his government officially opposed, greeted by a Serbian general who was simultaneously fighting Germans, communists, and Ustaše. While protecting over 300 American airmen, his forces had hidden across the territory. Mussolini's first task was assessing the situation. The airmen were scattered across dozens of villages. Many were injured, suffering from wounds sustained during bailout or subsequent movement through rough terrain. All needed food, medical care, and organization into groups that could be evacuated efficiently. The improvised airstrip had to be constructed in a location accessible to the airmen, but concealed from German observation. The site chosen was a field near Pranjani, a relatively flat area surrounded by low hills that would hide aircraft on approach. The field was currently planted with corn. Creating a runway meant clearing the corn, leveling the ground, and ensuring sufficient length for C-47 transports to land and take off. The C-47 required approximately 3,000 feet of runway for safe operations. The field was barely adequate. Serbian villagers worked through the night of August 1st and 2nd. 300 people with hand tools, cutting corn, pulling stumps, smoothing soil. No machinery was available. Everything was manual labor. The work had to be completed in darkness to avoid German detection. Sentries watched roads for patrols. Children served as runners, carrying messages between work parties. The entire village committed to the task, knowing that discovery meant German reprisal. By dawn on August 2nd, the airstrip was ready, barely adequate, dangerously short, but operational. Mussolini radioed the coordinates to 15th Air Force headquarters in Italy. The first evacuation flight was scheduled for that morning. Weather permitting, 6 C-47 transports would land in succession, load airmen, and depart before German forces could respond. The aircraft departed Brindisi, Italy, at 0500 hours. 6 C-47s from the 60th Troop Carrier Group, each capable of carrying 28 passengers. Fighter escort consisted of P-51 Mustangs from the 31st Fighter Group, tasked with protecting the transports and suppressing any German response. The flight plan called for low-level approach to avoid radar detection, quick landing and loading, immediate departure. The first C-47 landed at 0615 hours. The pilot, Captain Nick Lalich, brought the aircraft in over the hills, dropped onto the dirt strip, and rolled to a stop with minimal braking distance remaining. Serbian villagers rushed forward to guide airmen aboard. The loading process took 6 minutes. 24 airmen climbed into the aircraft, cramming into every available space. Lalich advanced throttles. The C-47 accelerated down the strip, lifted off with meters to spare, and climbed toward Italy. 5 more transports followed at intervals of 10 to 15 minutes. Each landing was barely controlled collision with terrain. Each takeoff tested the margins of aircraft performance, but every aircraft landed, loaded, and departed successfully. By 0800 hours, 144 American airmen had been evacuated. No German forces had appeared. The first phase of Operation Halyard was complete. The evacuees arrived in Italy in disbelief. Many had been behind enemy lines for weeks, living in conditions of medieval simplicity, dependent on peasants who shared their last food. The transition from Serbian farmhouses to American air bases was psychologically jarring. They were debriefed, medically examined, and given time to process their experiences before being assigned to new duties. Their stories were consistent. Serbian villagers had hidden them despite enormous risk. Families took in strangers, fed them from inadequate supplies, moved them to different villages when German patrols came near. The hospitality was not calculated or conditional. It was offered as duty. The Serbian tradition of protecting guests regardless of personal cost. One airman described being hidden in a cellar while German troops searched the house above. The family that sheltered him had children who knew an American was hiding below, but never revealed his presence despite German questioning. Another airman told of a village that shared its last livestock to feed hidden Americans, while the villagers themselves went hungry. These accounts documented courage that received no recognition, sacrifice that served no national interest except common humanity. The success of the first evacuation convinced Allied command to continue operations. More flights were scheduled. The improvised airstrip at Pranjani became a regular evacuation point. Over the next 4 months, C-47 transports would land there repeatedly, extracting airmen as they accumulated in Chetnik territory. But each flight increased the risk of German detection. The Luftwaffe had reconnaissance aircraft. German ground forces conducted regular patrols. Local collaborators might report the airstrip's location for reward. Maintaining security while conducting repeated operations in occupied territory required constant vigilance and luck. The Serbian villagers provided both. They maintained watch on German movements, reported patrol activity, and could disperse airmen to hidden locations within hours if necessary. The network operated through word of mouth and trusted intermediaries. No written records were kept. The entire system relied on personal relationships and shared risk. German forces did eventually learn that American airmen were being hidden in Serbian territory. Reprisals began. Villages suspected of harboring Americans were burned. Civilians were executed. The Germans applied collective punishment, a doctrine that held entire communities responsible for resistance activities. If Americans were hidden in a village, that village would be destroyed and its population killed or deported. The reprisals made the villagers' courage more remarkable. They continued sheltering airmen knowing the consequences of discovery had escalated from risk to certainty. Some families sent their hidden Americans away to protect the village. Others kept them despite the danger. The decision belonged to each family, and many chose continued hospitality over safety. Mihailovic's forces lost men protecting the evacuation operations. Chetnik units engaged German patrols to buy time for evacuations. They conducted diversionary attacks to draw German attention away from Pranjani. They maintained security around the airstrip during operations. These actions brought German reprisals against Chetnik areas. Villages associated with Mihailovic were targeted. The German policy was elimination. Kill the fighters, destroy the villages, terrorize the population into submission. The political situation complicated everything. Tito's partisans knew Americans were being evacuated through Chetnik territory. From Tito's perspective, this represented Allied support for his rival. He protested to British and American representatives, demanding that any evacuations occur through partisan territory. Allied command refused, pointing out that the airmen were in Chetnik areas and that moving them through contested territory to partisan lines would be more dangerous than direct evacuation. But the protest had consequences. Allied supply drops to Mihailovic, minimal already, stopped completely. British liaison officers with Chetnik forces were withdrawn. Mihailovic found himself simultaneously protecting American airmen, fighting Germans in Ustaše, and being abandoned by the Allies he was trying to help. The irony was bitter. His forces risked everything to protect Allied personnel, while Allied command supported his enemies. The evacuations continued through August, September, and October. Flights occurred every few days, weather permitting. The total rescued climbed 200, 300, 400. Each successful evacuation validated the operation but increased German determination to stop it. Luftwaffe fighters began patrolling the area. German ground forces increased their presence near Pranjani. The window for safe operations was closing. The last major evacuation occurred on December 27, 1944. By then, Soviet forces were entering Yugoslavia from the east. Partisan forces, supplied by the Soviets, were advancing across Serbia. German forces were retreating. The strategic situation had changed. Mihailovic's Chetniks, caught between advancing communists and retreating Germans, faced elimination. The final tally for Operation Halyard: 512 American airmen rescued. Not one evader lost during the evacuation process. Not one rescue aircraft shot down. Not one OSS officer killed or captured. By any measure, it was the most successful rescue operation of the Second World War, but recognition was absent. The operation was classified, partly to avoid publicizing cooperation with Mihailovich, partly because the techniques used might be employed in future operations. The airmen who were rescued were told not to discuss their experiences. The Serbian villagers received no acknowledgement. Mihailovich received no credit from the allies he had served. The post-war period brought tragedy for those who had made the operation possible. Tito's partisans captured Mihailovich in March 1946. He was tried for collaboration with the enemy and war crimes. The charges were politically motivated. Tito was eliminating rivals for power. Mihailovich defended himself by pointing to the protection of Allied airmen, the cooperation with Allied command, the sacrifices his forces had made. It was insufficient. He was convicted and executed by firing squad in July 1946. The Serbian villagers who had sheltered Americans faced similar fates. Tito's new communist government viewed Chetnik supporters as enemies. Villages that had harbored airmen were targets for retribution. Some villagers fled to Austria or Italy. Others remained and faced persecution. Their role in Operation Halyard became liability, proof of association with the wrong resistance movement. The American airmen, safely back in the United States or continuing their service, knew nothing of this. They had been debriefed, told the operation was classified, and instructed to move on. Most complied. Some tried to find information about the families that had hidden them. They discovered that official records listed Mihailovich as enemy, that the villagers were now under communist rule, and that any attempt to contact them could bring danger. Decades passed. The Cold War divided Yugoslavia from the West. Information about Operation Halyard remained classified. The airmen grew old, started families, built careers. Some never forgot the Serbian families that saved them. They passed down stories to children and grandchildren. Oral histories of kindness in the midst of war. The operation became public in the 1970s when some documents were declassified. Historians began investigating survivors of the operation. Both American airmen and Serbian participants were located and interviewed. The full scope of the operation emerged. Not just the military logistics of evacuating over 500 men, but the human network of courage and sacrifice that made it possible. Recognition came slowly. In 1946, Mihailovich had been posthumously awarded the Legion of Merit by President Harry Truman. But the award was kept secret due to political sensitivities. It was not formally acknowledged until 1948, and not publicized until decades later. The Serbian villagers received no awards from their own government, which considered them traitors for supporting the Chetniks. American veterans of Operation Halyard began advocating for recognition in the 1980s and 90s. They formed associations, collected testimonies, and lobbied for acknowledgement of the Serbians who had saved their lives. Some returned to Serbia after the fall of communism, seeking the families that had sheltered them 50 years earlier. A few found survivors. Most found only graves and memories. The village of Pranjani erected a memorial to Operation Halyard. The site of the improvised airstrip was preserved. Annual commemorations brought together American veterans and Serbian survivors. Elderly people remembering when they had been young and had risked everything for strangers. The ceremonies were bittersweet. Celebration of what had been achieved. Mourning for what had been lost. The operational lessons from Halyard were significant. The mission demonstrated that rescue operations behind enemy lines were feasible with proper planning, local support, and acceptance of risk. The techniques developed: improvised airstrips, local resistance coordination, sequential evacuations, would be refined and used in subsequent conflicts. But the human element, the willingness of civilians to risk death to protect strangers, could not be replicated by planning or doctrine. The C-47 transports that flew the missions were unremarkable aircraft. Maximum speed, 230 miles per hour. Range, 1,600 miles. Cargo capacity, 6,000 pounds or 28 passengers. They were workhorses, not glamorous, designed for reliability over performance. But in Operation Halyard, they performed missions that tested limits, landing on improvised strips barely long enough, taking off overloaded, flying through potentially hostile airspace. Every pilot knew that mechanical failure or German interception meant death or capture. They flew anyway because Americans were waiting for rescue. The P-51 Mustangs that escorted the transports provided insurance. These fighters, with drop tanks extending their range, could engage German interceptors and suppress ground fire. Their presence deterred Luftwaffe attacks and reassured transport crews. The escort missions were long, over 4 hours round trip, and pilots had to manage fuel carefully. Running dry meant ditching in the Adriatic or crash landing in Yugoslavia. Several escort pilots ended up becoming evaders themselves, hidden by the same network they had been protecting. The radio operators who maintained communications between Italy and Yugoslavia were critical. They worked with primitive equipment, battery-powered radios that required hand cranking to generate electricity. They transmitted coded messages about weather, German movements, and evacuation schedules. They were vulnerable. German direction-finding equipment could locate radio transmitters, and the Gestapo regularly hunted resistance radio operators. Several were captured and executed. The logistics of feeding and housing over 500 transient Americans in villages that had minimal surplus was staggering. Serbian peasants in 1944 lived at subsistence level. The German occupation had requisitioned food, livestock, and labor. Harvests were below normal due to war disruption. Adding hundreds of additional mouths to feed created severe hardship. Yet the villagers shared what they had, sacrificing their own nutrition to keep the Americans alive. Medical care for injured airmen was primitive. Serbian villages had no doctors, no hospitals, no modern medicine. Wounds were treated with folk remedies. Infections that antibiotics could have cured instead killed or crippled. Some airmen died from injuries that would have been survivable with proper medical attention. The villagers did what they could with what they had, which was almost nothing. The language barrier complicated everything. Few villagers spoke English. Few airmen spoke Serbian. Communication occurred through gestures, improvised sign language, and occasional interpreters who might have learned English from missionaries before the war. But somehow arrangements were made, needs were communicated, and the system functioned. The children of the villages adapted most easily. They learned English phrases from the airmen, taught them Serbian words, and served as intermediaries. They also served as sentries, watching for German patrols, and as couriers, carrying messages between villages. Their participation was dangerous. German forces did not distinguish between adult and child resistance members. Children caught carrying messages or acting as lookouts were executed like adults. The women of the villages bore disproportionate burden, with men away fighting for chetniks or hiding in mountains to avoid German labor conscription. Women managed households, worked fields, and cared for hidden airmen. They cooked, washed clothes, treated minor injuries, and maintained the appearance of normalcy while hiding dangerous secrets. If Germans searched a house, women faced interrogation that often included torture. Many endured this without revealing the Americans they were hiding. At 0600 hours on August 2nd, 1944, Mihailovich Jovanovic watched the first C-47 land on the field his village had prepared. He had worked through the night clearing corn, knowing that discovery meant death for everyone involved. He watched American airmen climb aboard the aircraft, men who had been guests in his home and others' homes, eating food the villagers could not spare, protected by people who owed them nothing except common humanity. The aircraft took off, climbed, and disappeared toward Italy. Jovanovic and his fellow villagers dispersed, covering evidence of the landing, preparing for the possibility that Germans had observed the operation. Over the next 4 months, the process would repeat, preparing the strip, gathering airmen, watching the aircraft arrive and depart, then erasing evidence and waiting. Jovanovic survived the war and lived to see communism fall. He attended commemorations of Operation Halyard, met American veterans who had been among those he helped save, and received recognition decades late for actions he considered simply duty. He never expressed bitterness about the lack of contemporary acknowledgement. The Americans had been guests. Protecting them had been obligation, not transaction. Operation Halyard stands as testament to what is possible when military capability combines with civilian courage. The OSS provided organization, the 15th Air Force provided aircraft, General Mihailovich provided security and coordination, but the Serbian villagers provided the foundation. The willingness to shelter strangers, to risk family and community for people they had never met and might never see again. To maintain that commitment through months when the costs became catastrophically clear. 512 Americans came home because hundreds of Serbian civilians decided that protecting them mattered more than personal safety. No recognition could fully acknowledge that sacrifice. No memorial could capture the fear of hiding strangers while German patrols passed within meters. The hunger of sharing insufficient food. The grief of seeing villages destroyed for acts of mercy. The greatest rescue mission you have never heard of succeeded because people you will never know decided that some obligations transcend nationality, politics, and self-preservation. Their names are mostly lost, recorded if at all in village records destroyed by war or communism, but their actions echo across decades, a reminder that courage is not always loud or acknowledged, and that the most important victories are often those that save individual lives rather than capture strategic objectives.